The views, comments, and opinions of the following program do not necessarily reflect those of Morris Media Studios, MorrisMediaLive.com, or its affiliates. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to With This Ring. My name is Dr. Jeshana Johnson.
And my name is Dr. Ryeal Simms.
With This Ring is a podcast dedicated to exploring the science of love and relationships. Each episode will take a deep look into how we either have successful or unsuccessful relationships, and how intimacy plays a role in all of our relationships. We'll look at its triumphs, its dysfunctions,
yes, definitely,
and our resolutions.
Yes.
And we hope that you enjoy listening to this and learning from
they're going to enjoy
this podcast. However, we also want to make sure that it is not meant to substitute for a personal relationship with a mental health provider.
Yeah.
A little bit about ourselves. I'm Dr. Jeshana Johnson, affectionately known as Dr. J.
Yes.
I am a professor and a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. I am the founder of the Intimacy Seminars and Psychological Services, specializing in couples, intimacy, sex issues. I have been married for 24 years and have 2 adult children, and excited to really be on this journey.
Wow, you don't look like it. You're so
you.
young. And I'm Dr. Ryeal Simms. I'm a neuropsychologist. And I'm also known as the relationship scientist. And I specialize in the brain and what goes on in the brain from an eco-biopsychosocial and spiritual point of view. So what's happening during relationships and during intimacy, I talk about what's really going on and what's really happening in the brain during that period. So, hey, I hope you're going to enjoy it. No, you're going to enjoy it because
Absolutely.
We're going to really just share so much information, and I'm really excited for this show. So let's do it.
All right.
Yeah.
So before we take a break, just want to let you know today's episode is talking about the science of intimacy. We will be exploring intimacy, the types of intimacy, and whether or not our relationships can do without them, and how to sustain intimacy over a long period of time.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to understand. There's different intimacy, because when we say intimacy, we think it's only one.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
But there's so many relationships, friendships, family. Right.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot. Yeah.
So we'll cover that right after this. Welcome back to With This Ring. I'm Dr. J, and my co-host.
And I'm Dr. Ryeal Simms.
Today we're going to take an intimate look at intimacy and how important it is in our relationships. And I think before we kind of get to talking about like the types of intimacy, intimacy means different things for different people.
Right.
So, Dr. Simms, tell me.
Yeah,
what's your definition?
One definition for intimacy is physical intimacy. And I think physical intimacy is so important in a relationship. And we're talking about touch. We're talking about kissing, hugging, and the things that happen when you hug and why it's so important. You see a lot of couples that really don't touch and they're not interacting with each other. And I think it's so important to have physical intimacy as well as emotional intimacy too as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for me, I was trained and I love to look at intimacy from a differentiation lens. And it talks about how there is other validated intimacy versus self-validated intimacy. And our first introduction to intimacy is really through our parents. And, as children, we learn about intimacy from our family of origin.
That's right.
And so what happens is, we learn to do things and be who people want them to be, because we want them to validate us.
That's right.
And so that's what our other validated intimacy is. And many of our relationships really start off with other validated intimacy.
Yeah. As well, like you said, when they were born too, that's also physical intimacy too. They're
Absolutely.
learning physical intimacy,
Right.
because the minute that you're being intimate with the child, like for instance, we know that the minute the mother bears a child, she releases oxytocin,
Absolutely.
which bonds you together, which
Yeah.
is a part of intimacy,
Yes.
right? So I think that that's really cool. And yeah, you're right. It starts right there.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So when we look at intimacy, how important is it for our relationships? What do you think?
It's very, very important. I mean, it's really, really important because it's a connection. And people think that it's not important, that you can just have a relationship without being intimate, emotional intimacy,
Right.
support.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Physical intimacy. I think it's so important. I wanted to tell a story. I remember when I was in an apartment and I could hear, actually, the walls were really thin, and I could hear my neighbors, right? And my wife and I, we used to talk a lot. And I was like, oh man, I wonder if they can hear us, because we can't really hear them, right? And I was like, wow, I thought the walls were thin because at one time I could hear. Well, come to find out that when they moved, new neighbors moved in, and when they were just talking normal, we could hear them, right? So what I discovered was that this couple didn't have that intimacy, that emotional intimacy. They didn't talk. They didn't talk. But they did have intimacy with who? The television.
Oh, yeah.
They had intimacy with television. And that's part of too, when we talk about, what are those, the love languages?
Right, absolutely.
Right?
The 5 love languages.
The 5 love languages. And when we're talking about being intimate and what's the one, being intimate and give me one of them.
Oh, so quality time.
Quality time. Thank you. Quality time. Well, see, people think too that quality time with each other is watching television
Right.
or
Not
looking at
paying
the movie.
attention to each
But
other.
you're not
Right.
paying attention
They're
to
not
each
turned
other.
towards each other.
No, absolutely. Your quality time is with the television.
Absolutely.
That's what the quality time with. You're being intimate with the TV, right?
Right.
And that's what I discovered. And when I talked to the guy when they were moving, he said, "Yeah, man, we're really going through it." And I was like, "They don't communicate."
Right.
They don't communicate. That is one of the intimacies.
Absolutely.
We think it's just touch too,
Right.
but it's actually to articulate with each other, communicate with each other, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have a belief in many of us in the field have a belief that we come from our families of origin based on what we experience is how we then show up in our relationships
That's
with
right.
intimacy. And so if we weren't intimate in our childhood, if they didn't give us hugs then we
right.
don't know how to.
That's right.
And so we go into our relationships with this psychological blueprint, right? That gives us the setup for how to show up in relationships. And then we don't show up.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Like you
we
said.
spend a lot of time showing up for the wedding, but we never show up for the relationship.
That's right. Absolutely. And just like you said, if you don't get hugs when you're a child, and that's so important. And if you don't get that, and then once you get into the relationship, then you don't really realize why it's important to even give those hugs. You don't hug, right? And you wonder, why aren't you affectionate, right? Physical touch, right?
Absolutely.
And that's why. It's because, I didn't realize that was so important. But then too, there are times that you realize something's missing inside.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that something is when you discover what good and how good it feels to be held, right? To release that serotonin when you hold, when you hug, or when you stop a certain person that snores. If your significant other snore, just give them a hug, and when you hug, they'll stop snoring because they're releasing serotonin at that time that you're hugging.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's really, really important to understand each and every last one of those type of, spiritual.
Yeah.
Spiritual too. And let's not leave out friends and family. Right. Because I think that's really important.
And I think what ends up happening is that couples tend to develop their physical intimacy first. Mm-hmm. It's the most easiest to develop, but it's not the most powerful to develop. Right. We'll develop our physical intimacy and lack in our emotional intimacy. Mm-hmm. Emotional intimacy is kind of like the foundation. Yes. That's our safety, our trust. But we have difficulty sometimes with vulnerability and trusting other people. And one of the things I when I'm working with couples, I talk to them about the importance of learning how to trust self first. Yes. That trust is really not about the other person. That's right. One of my favorite sayings is a bird sitting on the tree is not afraid of its branch breaking because it's trust is in its wings. That's right. And so when we trust ourselves, we have the ability to understand that we can bounce back from anything. That's right. Love and connection is really a risk that you take. Yeah. And you may or may not be hurt, but we're human and we're experienced that. And you have to understand we can bounce back from that. That's right. But I find that in working with couples, a lot of our emotional intimacy is what we kind of is underdeveloped. It's lacked. Right, right. Absolutely. And you got to have both. You got to have emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. And, sometimes you find couples that actually have one or the other. Right. And you might have one that's just so physical and one that's emotional, but you have to have both. That's why it's so important to actually have that conversation, is to communicate. Right. And what I like what you said too, understanding one's trust first. Right. And so how does that happen? And I think it's understanding self. We have to take out time to get to know self. Right. Especially for the single people, that's a great opportunity for you to get to know self again. Right. Take out time to understand self and to trust self, because knowing self, actually, one of my sayings is respecting self, is knowing self in order to love self. Right. And I think it's so important to take out that time to know self, trust self, and that way, and understand, knowing and trusting, you can now be vulnerable, because is that what you said too? That was one of the good ones that you said. And I think that that's so important, and being vulnerable, because it's so important in friendimacy too as well, right? Yeah. I completely agree. Yeah. And I think one of the things of knowing who you are, like our own sense of self, is so important, is because if we don't have a sense of self, we will get in relationships and want to kind of merge with other people, and we'll become dependent on what we call a reflective sense of self. Yes. If you don't know who you are, then you're going to be dependent on somebody kind of holding up a mirror and showing you who they want you to be or need you to be, and it's not necessarily who you are. But if you don't know who you are, you get in relationships, and then you kind of, because you can't stand on your own, you take this time to kind of merge, and that's where you hear people talk about they felt suffocated, they lost themselves because they didn't know who they were when they actually went into that relationship. Yeah. And sometimes maybe developing their physical intimacy prior to their emotional intimacy can cause difficulties because of the chemical highs and things like that. That kind of tricks us into believing we're in love and all of that. And so
absolutely. Yeah, I so agree. Especially that main chemical, oxytocin. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Because you're so right. Because when you start that physical relationship too soon, and I believe too, if you start that physical relationship too soon, then at least give yourself a chance, give yourself time, to see if this person really is a person that should be in your life, or at least have the potential to be in your life, because it's so important. And we'll talk about it later on, and because it's really important when we talk about those chemicals, oxytocin, serotonin, norepinephrine, phenylethylamine. When we talk about those chemicals, it also shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the two parts of our brain and our frontal lobe, which now we can't really, we can't think straight.
Yeah,
right. So we can't make correct decisions and choices because we're so high. We're on this altered state of consciousness, this euphoria.
Exactly.
Right. And these chemicals are really going. Yeah.
You can't make sound decisions.
You can't make sound decisions, man. You're like, oh my God, yes.
Right.
Like nothing's gonna ever happen. We're never gonna have an argument, and so we don't even concentrate. Sometimes we become selfish because we don't concentrate on that intimacy, on what that person needs,
and developing it,
right? And developing it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Great point.
What do you think is more important? Do you think in a relationship for longevity? Is it physical intimacy? Is it emotional intimacy? Is it spiritual intimacy? And
I think it's all. I think it's all. I think you need it all.
I think combination of all.
Yeah, I think you need a combination. I think it's a cluster of those, and I think it's so important because if you don't have that spirituality, right, something to believe in, especially from that male, and I'm not saying your own particular a particular religion
or anything. Your own
spiritual love, your own spiritual belief, whatever that is, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's really important, and to have both, to have that emotional, to have that physical. Because sometimes we can't be physical, right? So I need your emotional support. I need that emotional intimacy from you. And it's so wonderful, especially when you just sit down and have that conversation, right? And you being intimate, having that intimate conversation and sharing and being able to actually disagree, right? And, and being able to say, you're right.
Right.
You're right. I'm wrong. That's a good point.
To me, that's that self-validated intimacy.
Yeah.
Sometimes people who are dependent on that other validated intimacy, like if I'm dependent on you validating me, I'm only going to show you the parts of me that's going to get validated.
That's right.
And a lot of times that happens in the beginning of our relationship.
Yeah.
I'm say the things that you're going to like. I'm going to do the things that you're going to like. And you're going to give me feedback.
Yes.
But the minute that you stop giving me feedback, then are you still in love with me? Have you fallen out of love with me? You can't really kind of hold on to yourself. But if you're able to if I'm able to validate myself, then I can have self-validated intimacy. I can still hold on to myself and know who I am without somebody having to show up and kind of hold me up. This is what I call borrowed functioning.
Yes. That's a great one. Borrowed functioning.
So
that's totally awesome. Remember that. Write that down. And I'm going to write that down. Yes.
And so it's important to understand they're not two different types of intimacy, but they're two different processes, a part of this one bigger thing called intimacy.
Yeah.
When we're talking about our intimacy with our families, I love Esther Perel's work and how she says, show me how you were loved and I'll show you how you make love.
Wow. That's deep.
Because how we're loved in our families and the relationships that we have with our sisters and our brothers and our mothers and things like that, how we are able to give and receive shows up in our relationships across the line. It's not just with our romantic partners. It's not just with our husbands and our wives. It is with everybody.
That's right.
If I have a connection issue in my romantic relationship, in my union with my husband, I'm more than likely probably have a connection issue in other areas.
Yeah.
And so absolutely. Intimacy goes across all relationships.
That's right, and as well as friends, right? Friendship,
absolutely.
Because I think it's so important to understand, and how do we understand being intimate with a friend, with the best friend? And I think understanding that is knowing that the friend that you with is a positive friend, right? There's a hierarchy too, just like the Maslow's law.
Right.
We all have a need to belong.
Absolutely.
And there's another one that is positive and consistent and vulnerability, what you mentioned before. And just knowing that your friends that you are around are positive friends, right? Positive friends, people that have something positive to say, positive to communicate, to articulate with each other, you know, not somebody that's I mean, I've experienced being with certain men that was so machoistic, egotistic, narcissistic, supercilious, draconian tyrants where, you know, every time I would say something, you know, every time I would say something, this guy was always against, you know, he was always putting me down. You know, I come up with a hypothesis or a theory and he's like, oh no, man, I don't know.
Right.
I'm like, gosh, this dude is not positive, right? You know, and I want to be around somebody that's positive, somebody that's going to lift me up. When we're talking as best friends and I come up with something and he could at least say, you know, wow, I got to think about that, man. Right. You know, that sounds good.
When you say positive though, do you think that our friends have to always agree with us?
No.
Okay.
No, that's the beauty of it. You know, that's the beauty of it when we could sit and we can have that conversation.
Right.
You know, but not when it's consistently. When you know constantly.
Like when you're just
like whatever you say all the time, that person is they got to answer for everything. And yours are never good, right? They're always putting you down, right? And it's like, oh my God. I mean, everything I say is not, you know, doesn't make sense, right? So, yeah, I think it's so important to understand that when the friends that you pick that are positive friends and consistent, right? You know, that's consistent friends, the friends that's there for you consistently, not just every once in a while, right? And that's vulnerable. So that friend that you can actually open up to. That's the intimacy that you can actually open up to, that you can talk to your friends about any and everything without judgment, right? That's intimacy. When you know you can get on the phone, and that's when you know, I really love my friend. I really love my friend because that's somebody that I can really go to. So that's important to understand that in intimacy too, when it's friendimacy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Intimacy occurs it can occur in all of our relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's important too to teach kids about intimacy at a young age, because it's going to follow them. You know, I'm always amazed at how we understand that babies need care and love and nurturing. And then from the time we become from kids to adults, some kind of way, we learn that we don't need anybody. And we say things like that when we've been hurt in relationships. And that's absolutely not true. Right. You know, Dr. Susan Johnson talks about how we need connection and intimacy from the cradle to the grave. There's no way that we can really survive this without it. Yeah. And so we have to really move towards developing that in people.
That's right.
All of that emotional intimacy, the physical intimacy, and the spiritual intimacy.
And the spiritual intimacy. I think that's so good too. You know, I think that's really important to have conversations about your spirituality. I mean, it's good to just have conversations about it, right?
Right, absolutely.
You know, and you get a better understanding of what she thinks or he thinks, right? And I think, man, that communication, that emotional intimacy is just totally awesome. You know, and I'm so glad that you said, do you have to always agree? No, that's the fun about it. That's the fun part.
You know, when couples come and see me, they tend to talk about how we have communication issues. Yeah. And when we get to the root of it, what we look at is it's really not a communication issue as much as it's a connection issue. Yeah. I believe that we communicate with people based off the connection we have. If I don't have a good connection with you, then I'm probably going to talk to you any kind of way that I want to, or not talk to you at all. Right. But when we have a good connection, we tend to have good communication. Yeah. Can we develop our communication skills? Absolutely. And that is definitely part of the intimacy. That is definitely part of getting in our partner's internal world and kind of learning about them. I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's important too. You know, we actually are intimate with our, people say when it comes to communication that, oh, we stop communication. We don't communicate anymore. And actually you do, because that's impossible to not communicate.
Can you tolerate the message? Can you tolerate
the message? Because, and what we mean by that is, if you're not communicating verbally, you're always communicating non-verbally, physically.
Body
language and slamming stuff. And, you're saying something when you do that, right?
Yeah.
But what I like, too, is when I was mentioning, you are intimate with your teacher, getting to know your teacher, having that connection with your teacher, right? And just knowing that connection that you have with your teacher, and to be intimate with your teacher, to be able to ask questions,
right,
and
not be afraid
to want, right,
or need,
because you're going to need some answers as well. Not being afraid to raise your hand, because you got that connection with your teacher. And one good thing that I got from that, when it comes to that communication and intimacy of communicating and that emotional support, is one of the gifts that we all really have, and we don't really realize that we have this when it comes to communication, is that we can communicate because we listen to teachers to understand. Because the key to communication is really understanding the communication. And it was like, well, we having a problem. No. You can do this. You went through grammar school. You went through high school. You went through college. And you did that by listening to the teacher, right? Comprehending the teacher, right? You're being an empirical listener in order to respond correctly. So you do have that skill. You have the skill to listen, or you would listen to get an A, right? You listen to pass the class.
Absolutely.
Right?
So you can listen to your partner.
You can listen to your, hey, right here. You can listen to your partner.
Yeah.
Because you listen to graduate.
Absolutely.
The only way that you can graduate, that's how you that's the tool that you use.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think we're going to take a break right now.
We are. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll be discussing how to sustain intimacy in long-term marriages.
Yes. Hi, and welcome back to With This Ring. I'm Dr. Ryeal Simms, and we're talking about right now intimacy and different parts of intimacy, right?
And I'm Dr. J, and we'll be talking a little bit more about our types of intimacy during this segment and if, our marriages can sustain without it. I want to just kind of go back a little bit and, define what these types of intimacy is. And we touched a little bit on spiritual intimacy. And for me, spiritual intimacy is our ability to kind of connect with something higher than ourselves. But that intimacy that gives our relationship purpose, right? So for me, I believe that, my purpose in life is connected to something greater than I am. And when I share that with my husband, it creates a greater spiritual intimacy between us and what we believe in, giving our relationship a purpose,
right,
that we
Absolutely.
serve. And so spiritual intimacy is important. It's not just the connection to each other, but it's also this connection to a greater being than ourselves.
Yeah, I like that, and that sounds great. You're so right. Having that connection with just not only the two of you, but with the highest supreme being, right? And I think that that's so important to have that connection and that intimacy. Because it helps with the two of you too, as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what about family though? What do you think about the intimacy and when it comes to the family and mother and father or daughter and son?
Right. And I also want to say this too in regards to that, because intimacy is really shaped by context, like culture and religion and all of that, that plays a role in how we participate in intimacy.
Right.
when you ask the question, about intimacy with our families, there is intimacy that we witness between our parents, right? And then there's the intimacy that we experience with our parents or with our siblings. I'm really close to my brothers, right? So being intimate with them is sharing parts of me. I can go to my brother and tell him something and being supported. Yes. And not and unconditional,
without judgment.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
That unconditional love that we look for in our siblings, and with our parents and with our cousins. I have cousins. My first cousins, one of my favorite cousins, we're 29 days apart, and I call her my sister cousin. I'm very intimate with her. The hugging part. Fathers and sons having that physical intimacy between a father and son, being able to kind of ignore our dominant, masculinity that we're taught to be able to actually really hug our sons, so that sons understand emotions. I think we're so emotionally inept in our relationships because we don't engage in these physical and emotional intimacy in our families first. How do we develop intimacy later if we haven't developed it
at home?
At home.
And I like when you said too, when you're mentioning about being, because that's part of being vulnerable when it comes to the masculine male, know, the alpha male, and we're men and we don't touch, we don't hug. But when you actually see that, I think it really has an effect on us when we actually see that. We actually respond to seeing a father-son hugging and communicating with each other. We actually could feel that. And, that also release oxytocin and serotonin.
That's
right. And I think it's so important. And that's that's really good to mention. How can you do it with a relationship if you haven't done it at home yet?
Because you haven't learned it.
Because you haven't learned
it.
And I think that's really, really important, especially with the father-son. During that time of sports too as well. We know on Sunday, the football, right?
Yeah.
I get a chance to touch and get a chance to high five.
Right. We're comfortable with the high five, right?
Yeah.
We're comfortable with seeing men do the high five, but for some reason we kind of get uncomfortable with seeing them hug and saying "I love you."
I love you.
I love you. Hearing those words, "I love you." Yeah. And even in like our social media now, you text is like "love you." What? I love you. Like we've kind of watered it down.
I like that.
So we're not really experiencing it early on, so we can't really take that into our relationships at a later time. Yeah. And it's definitely impacting our relationships.
That's deep. That is really deep. And I think that's so important, especially for the men today to understand, it's okay to say I love you. It's okay to hug. It's okay to even call and say, hey, Dad, I was just thinking about you, man. I just wanted to say I love you. Wow. I mean, something like that happens, when you hear that.
Absolutely.
Just hearing that. Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Yeah, great.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about the emotional part of intimacy, which is really important too in our relationships, being able to be vulnerable. We don't like that V word for some reason, and we do everything that we can to really prevent having to experience that. And granted, it may come from, maybe we didn't have a good upbringing or a childhood, and maybe we have experienced hurt in our relationships. However, vulnerability is our ability to really to take risks to love. In order to love, you have to take that risk to do that. And so when we try to avoid it, we develop these like dysfunctional ways of being, and we do these like walls. We do these walls. And if I have a wall, how can I be emotionally connected to you if something is there preventing me from doing so? I remember I was working with a young lady, and she said that, she had grew up and she was the oldest of 5 kids, and, her mother worked and her dad was addicted to drugs. And so the mental blueprint for her was, I don't want to get into a relationship with anybody who does drugs. And so she grew up saying, I'm not going to have kids, and I'm not going to deal with anybody who uses drugs, who drinks alcohol, and things like that. And she grew up, she did end up having kids, but the relationship that she ended up having was, she was conscious of the characteristics she didn't want, but she didn't look at the unconscious characteristics that she didn't get. And so she ended up getting in a relationship with somebody who didn't use drugs, but he was emotionally unavailable to her.
Wow.
Just like her father was. And so if we're not careful in understanding what intimacy is and what it looks like in our families, we will then grow up and seek that out.
Yes.
Right? You sometimes wonder, like, how do I keep getting in the same type of relationships with the same type of people?
Right. Absolutely.
It's the same person.
That's right.
Right?
In a different body.
In a different package.
Right.
It doesn't matter who delivered it, UPS.
Absolutely.
United States Post Office, all of that.
Right. All of that. When we ever talk about one day, we're going to talk about detoxing.
Oh, yeah.
And that is one of the great examples too as well. So you're so right. I think it's just so important to have those lessons at home before you go out. And like you said, you end up having the same, seeking out the same person in a different body.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
And so I want to talk a little bit about how can marriages survive without intimacy. And so there was a study that was done in the UK, and they surveyed like 5,000 people. And one of the things was they ended up getting like a divorce, or they experienced infidelity in their relationship, partly because there was no emotional intimacy. Yeah. So about 48% of the women talked about how there was a lack of emotional intimacy, and about 30-something% men said that they lacked emotional intimacy.
So
as
what
well.
are some of the tips of emotional?
So some of the tips of emotional intimacy is really learning how to kind of what I believe is kind of like these 4 points of balance. You really have to know who you are, so that you're not expecting your partner to kind of hold you up and carry you around. That gets a little bit tiring, right? So once I can kind of know who I am, I leave room for my relationship to kind of grow. Yeah. And I can be close to you without feeling like I'm going to be smothered. I can be close to you without feeling like I'm going to be hurt. I can trust you because I trust myself. Wow. But that has to do with self-work first. Yeah. We gotta look at our own hurts first and kind of heal from that. We say all the time, hurt people hurt people. Right? And so if I'm hurt, I really can't develop my intimacy with you because I'm hurt and I'm afraid that you'll hurt me. Yeah. So how do we do that? One, really talk to somebody. Yeah. Go and it's okay for us to go talk to a therapist or a counselor or a pastor, somebody who's going to be supportive. Ask for what you need. We in our community do not like to ask for, we do not like to want, right? Because somebody might tell us no. And so it's important to be able to ask for what you need and what you want from the relationships you're in. Even if it's a friend, if it's a friend, can I ask you for what I want or need in this relationship? If it's my husband, can I ask you for what I want or need in my relationship? Wow. So being able to know who you are so that you can know, and your core values is what kind of runs your life, what runs my life, and then what I need. What do I need from you in this relationship? Wow. Yeah. Being able to be okay with asking for that.
Asking for it. And I think that's really important. That's wow. That's emotional intimacy.
Yeah. And I think, as for really women, we have to kind of take this like invisible cape that we have on that we go around saying I'm a strong, independent woman and I don't need anything. Let's take these capes off.
Oh man,
even Superwoman took hers off when.
Can you please talk about that?
You know, I think it's so important because I can't develop true intimacy with you if I have this barrier. Either it's a wall or a cape.
Right, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, too, about the independent comment, because you're just setting yourself up for not only depression, but for loneliness. Because what you do is constantly you keep paraying, or I'm trying to think of another word, to...
it makes us push people away.
You push people away. The more you push people away, the more you say that term, what you're doing is creating a different neural pathway in your brain. What you're doing is actually creating neurons in your brain. And the brain says, what happens is it says, I don't need. I'm independent, which means by myself. Right? So what you're doing is that you're actually creating these neurons in your brain.
And those neurons are going to talk to the next
neuron. It's going to talk to the next neuron. And what's going to say, the neuron's going to say, hey, you know what? We don't need. And you actually send off that frequency. So when you're someplace around other guys and everything, or a party or something like that, the men, we actually feel that frequency and smell it. We actually sense that something that we call the major histocompatibility complex, and that's identifying one's immune system, one's DNA, right? And we can sense that you have this frequency of I don't need, and what that does is that causes us to not approach you, right?
Absolutely.
To come to you,
and then you're upset because nobody want to approach you.
Nobody want to approach you, right? And so that leads to what? Loneliness.
Yeah.
And with loneliness, you have no intimacy with anybody.
And you can't be intimate because you're giving off the signals you're
giving off the signals that you don't want. And even if you did get into a relationship, that is so embedded in your brain, those neurons. The minute you are in a relationship, you're still keeping them back because you haven't taken out time to recondition those neurons, because the neurons is like, hey, remember, we don't need need to be intimate.
Right.
You know, you have intimacy with your own self, remember? You know, so don't touch them. And that's why it's so important to understand that touch, you know, something like our primary somatosensory cortex, when we touch something, it gives us the details of what we touch, who we touch, and how we touch. And our primary pituitary adrenal axis, our response to stress, right? And it's so important to understand that touch and slow touch that responds to our body, gives us that emotional feeling that we get from,
and triggers our parasympathetic nervous system to calm us down,
to keep us. Say it one more time, please.
Our parasympathetic nervous system.
That's right.
That will calm us down. If we're tense and we're in this fight or flight, I can't be intimate.
I can't be intimate. And it's so important to understand
if I can't trust you, I can't trust. If I can't trust you, I can't be intimate with you. That's right. If I can't trust myself, I won't allow myself to be intimate with you because of my own fears.
That's right. And our parasympathetic system is something that goes crazy when our sympathetic nervous system that goes crazy when we are, you know, in a fight or flight situation. Absolutely.
And everything is a threat.
Everything is a threat. You become a threat. You become a threat.
Right. Exactly. You
become a threat. I don't want to be intimate with you.
If my sympathetic nervous system is, the alarms are going off and it's saying like, hey, you either need to fight or flight, that's not intimacy.
That's right.
And so, and when if I'm with my partner and I feel like it's a threat, then I'm either going to fight them or I'm going to flee. But that's not intimacy.
But that's not intimacy. Absolutely.
And we have to look at how do we turn towards our partner
Yeah.
versus turning away. When we're hurt, we have to learn how to lick our own wounds and settle ourselves down so that we can return back to our partners. We're so quick to turn away from our partners. If you look at how you're coping with some of the intimacy or a fear of intimacy or the relationship, if it's causing you to turn away from your partner, that's not a good coping strategy.
That's right.
Right? It's building those walls that's going to keep you.
Yeah. And we need those chemicals.
Absolutely.
We need those chemicals. We need something like we talked about the oxytocin. And the oxytocin is what so we're like when you have a child, you release oxytocin, and that's what binds you. Well, also with the couple, when you're being intimate,
right? When you're having sex.
Okay. All right, say it again. When
you're having sex,
yes.
And women orgasm or men orgasm, there's a release of oxytocin, and that is saying, "I like this. Let's stay together." Things like that. And so it's important to understand sex, the physical intimacy, right, part of sex, and sex can be intimate or not. Then sex can be intimate or cannot be intimate, because you have people who kind of check out as well.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Because sex, with sex intimacy, it's so important, because when you release that oxytocin and it bonds you, it says, I like that your mesolimbic dopaminergic pathways open up all of those different ventral tegmental areas, the caudate nucleus, the nucleus accumbens areas, and that creates more bond.
Absolutely.
And it feels so good, and it's so important, because those are really, and we go back to just spiritual, right? Those are these chemicals. Those are chemicals that are created by God to keep that couple together,
That's
right?
Absolutely.
So those chemicals are so important to receive that oxytocin, to receive that serotonin. That serotonin is to keep you, that cuddle. I mean, as well as oxytocin, the cuddling, but the serotonin too is also to give you that brief of feel good, like, oh wow, I really like this, and I think it's really important to receive that. That's why it's important to cuddle. It's important to touch, so you could get these different mechanisms, these different brain regions to release these neurotransmitters and these chemicals and the pheromones and everything too. And that's another one too, because when we release our pheromones, why is it so important to be emotional and physical together? When we release these certain pheromones, it's one thing that just when a significant other gets out of the bed and you find yourself gravitating over to the other side, it's because that person's immune system and DNA is there, and it you got a chance to get it out when you were intimate last night. Right. So all that DNA is all in the bed, all on that side, and so when you're relaxing, it just goes all on that side and all on the pillow. So you're gravitating over there and you're smelling the DNA and the immune system, and it's wonderful, right? So smell is so important. You mentioned that before, I
want to talk a little bit about whether or not a marriage can last without intimacy. And I think sometimes people...
And what can we do to help it last?
Absolutely. Right? And I think people use the word sex and intimacy synonymously. Yeah. And so intimacy, sex can be intimate, but it doesn't have to be. Right. Intimacy stands all by itself, but sex can be a part of physical and emotional intimacy.
Right, absolutely.
And when we think of it in that aspect, the question is, can a marriage really last without intimacy? And I'm going to say, not a good one.
Not a good one. Absolutely.
I think that couples all the time make adjustments for staying in a marriage that doesn't have intimacy.
Yeah.
And that looks like sleeping in a different room, taking separate vacations, not communicating. And for whatever reason that they choose to stay in the marriage without the intimacy, I don't think that is something they would want to
absolutely.
do. I don't know that they would even label it as a good marriage.
Right,
you know?
absolutely.
There's a difference between a marriage and roommates, right? There's a difference between a marriage and the friendship, this platonic friendship. So I'm going to say I don't think that a good marriage can be is sustainable without some form of intimacy.
At least one of them, because then you can work on the other. So if you do have emotional intimacy, then you can work on physical intimacy. If you have, either one, it's, at least you have that. But some people have nothing at all, like you said, and it become roommates. So what can we do to actually build intimacy? And I think one of the important things is novelty. Novelty, right? Doing something different, doing something crazy, doing something. I have a story when people jump. What do you call it? The guys that go onto the mountains and they jump off the mountain, right, with the parachute and everything, right? And when they're doing that, eventually. We know, just like falling in love, the difference between in love and true love, we have all of these chemicals and everything. We're at this altered state of consciousness, this euphoria. So when we jump off the mountain, eventually that mountain becomes very sort of boring, right? It's like, okay, we've done this several times. And okay, so what happens is novelty is finding another mountain to jump off of. And that creates more anticipation, the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathways, dopamine, right? It gives you more dopamine now. So it's giving you that adrenaline, right? Because we're at a new mountain right now, right? And this is also sometimes what happens with couples that don't try to work it out because they go out and look for a new mountain.
And that's where we'll come. That's where I'll talk a little bit, just a tease a bit about the difference between intimacy and eroticism. See, intimacy likes stability. Intimacy likes knowing. Eroticism likes novelty and mystery. Esther Perel's work looks at how a lot of times it's in the beginning of these relationships that space and mysteriousness and distance that creates this wanting to get to them. Remember when the phone rang, you were hoping it was them, wasn't sure, but you got that heart flutter. And when our hearts start and our heart rates are up, arousal happens, right? And so what happens is then over time, we've said everything, we've discussed everything, we've talked about everything, and intimacy kind of kills eroticism, And so then what happens is later on, we've done all that, and there's no newness.
There's no newness.
There has to be a balance between. I'm working with a couple now. Like there has to be a balance between intimacy, this predictability and things like that, and this unpredictability and this newness and things like that. So we have to be able to vacillate between that because we end up losing desire.
Yeah, and it's easy to do. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's not a legerdemain or prestidigitation. It's not a magic trick. Right? It's something that we can actually do. And I think when we talk about that novelty too, doing something new, I'll just give a little story, when I sometimes I would get into bed and just do this weird dance and my wife would just laugh. It was really weird. I wouldn't do it in public, but I'm doing this crazy dance, but I know she's laughing. She's laughing so hard. She's crying. And I'm like, okay, let me do it again. Let me keep doing it, like a little kid, like, when can I stop, right? But that's something new. That's something different, And I know that if I have to pull that out, I'll go and, pull that out and go, oh, yeah, well, let me do the bad thing, and bring that out, right? Okay. So I think it's really, really important to understand and to actually deal with novelty, doing something new, bringing something new into the relationship. Because just like we were talking about the guys that's jumping off the mountains, when they found a new mountain, it was like that whole, all those chemicals came right back up again. All those same chemicals, the vasopressin, the phenylethylamine that we find in chocolate, right? Women love the chocolate, the phenylethylamine, everybody's like, oh my God, right? All of that came right back, so you can bring it back. So it's important to, like we talked about earlier, to see a counselor or a therapist if you can't do it yourself.
Absolutely.
Right, to get worked with. Yeah.
So now we'll do our final thoughts, and I will say that we talked a little bit about, having our own blueprints, and those blueprints come from our family of origin. And while I believe that those blueprints can't necessarily be changed, I learned a long time ago from one of my favorite professors. She said, you can't change, the only way you change the past is to change the behavior in the present. And so we have to do something different to have better intimacy in our relationships.
That's right. I like that. And I guess that leads to, as well, as listening to us, reading books, going to a counselor or therapist, getting information to prepare yourself, because my saying is preparing yourself is to prevent repairing yourself.
Absolutely. So to find out more information about me, you can find me at theintimacyseminars.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at The Intimacy Seminars.
And to find me, you can go to drryealsimms.com. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, The Relationship Scientist. You can look up The Relationship Scientist or Dr. Ryeal Simms. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. It's been great.